Hello and welcome to PocketGamer.biz's news roundup of the week, and this is for the week ending the 27th of September. It's been a pretty busy week this week. I mean, last week ended with the kind of, not necessarily shock news, but I guess it was shock in terms of the timing that BlackBerry had announced that it was going to kind of lose about $1 billion in its quarterly figures, mainly due to a write-down on the Z10. It's kind of phone that it launched earlier in the spring, and while that was over the weekend, so the kind of shares obviously were suspended at that point, or not for sale. So while people were considering that, we woke up on Monday morning to the news that BlackBerry's largest shareholder, which is a Canadian venture group, which had about 10% of the company, put in a bid to basically to buy all the outstanding shares, which valued the company about $4.7 billion. So, I mean, in a way, that's kind of a sensible move, because at least it gets BlackBerry off the stock exchange, which means it doesn't have to give it out terrible figures every quarter, and it just gives it a bit of, I guess, a bit of opportunity to kind of rebuild the business without it being in the public eye. Of course, it doesn't change anything in terms of the business that BlackBerry has. I mean, BlackBerry has said it's going to basically pull out of mid-range phones, so it's going to have very low-end phones that do very well in emerging markets with hard keyboards, and says it's going to focus on early adopter high-end devices, which seems pretty unlikely to do any better than what it's been doing. Anyway, and obviously enterprise is the place where BlackBerry's always done very well, so we would tend to assume that in the future BlackBerry will not be focusing on games very much, which would be sad for people who did have BlackBerry phones and wanted to play games, and developers who did release games for BlackBerry phones. They probably didn't make vast sums of money, but it's one, I guess, channel that now no longer exists. But talking of companies on the stock exchange, there's been a few other kind of bubbling under stories about companies who have shares, because they have to tell us about what's going on with their companies because they're publicly owned. So actually one that I kind of missed out on actually happened last week. Glu Mobile, which is a company I kind of like following, it announced, not really secretly, but because it can't do it secretly, but it put out a public kind of a rights issue. So basically it created a whole bunch more shares, which sold for about, it got, in terms of its net revenue, it got about $14 million in cash. That's kind of interesting because while it's completely changed around its business, it used to be a paid mobile game publisher, and it's completely now pretty much 100% a free-to-play game publisher, quite different businesses. It's been losing money every quarter, pretty much every quarter for about the last 4 years. But it's done several rights issues in the past. 2 years ago, it said it had raised enough money to take itself through to profitability, which it hoped it would do at the end of 2013. But it looked like that it may not have kind of fulfilled that, and I kind of wrote an article a while back suggesting that it probably had about 6 to 9 months left of cash before it went bust. Obviously now it's got another $13 million of cash, so it's probably got another 6 months. Well, and we wish Glu well. We hope it doesn't go bust, but it's difficult to turn around a loss-making company, particularly when you haven't made any profits for a long time. But one company not worrying about losses at all, just worrying about how big its profits will be now, is King, once known as King.com. So as has been suspected for a long time, it wants to do an IPO, sell its shares on the American NASDAQ market. And if you want to do that as a company, you have to, a couple of months before you want to put out your kind of intentions so people can buy shares, you have to file legal papers, and it's been reported that King has now done that. It's also got a new CFO, Chief Financial Officer, presumably to take it through that process. It's not really public information yet about what the share price will be or how many shares it will sell, but people are reckoning a valuation of about $5 billion. So that's bigger than a BlackBerry at the moment, if you want to put it that way. So I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about King.com. Not King, it's not .com anymore, just King, as they go towards IPO. Some other stories that have been kind of bubbling under. I think we'll have a bit more of them in future weeks. But misspeaking, it's always difficult for the politicians, aren't they? They're not misquoted, they misspoke. But apparently at an internal EA kind of conference meeting, so with EA staff, one of their senior executives was talking about a game just out on iOS, so Plants and Zombies 2, which has done pretty well for them. And he was, it's kind of hard to tell because obviously it wasn't filmed or anything, so he may be saying it in a jocular manner, but he was saying, when someone said, why is it not out on Android yet, he said, Apple paid us a truckload of money, that's the quote, truckload of money, to keep it on iOS, which is a kind of a rumour people have suggested for years, really, that Apple have... well, kind of. I mean, the question is, will they persuade people? Will there be like a contra marketing deal that don't release on Android and will give you lots of featured slots? But even if you're joking, a truckload of money is not like a truckload of marketing. A truckload of money is money, isn't it? Anyway, EA have firmly stamped down on these rumours, say that nothing of the case happens, and Apple have even announced a curt no, this isn't the case, but. The guy in person is a very senior EA guy, so maybe he was joking and it came out wrong, but it's interesting nevertheless. But eventually all games do come to Android, so we even heard that Clash of Clans, obviously one of the few games really that's just on iOS at the moment, and obviously it's making so much money on iOS, you could argue they don't really need to go on Android, but there's more Android devices, so maybe they could get another 50% revenue if they went on Android, so that's apparently been in... not soft launch release, it's like being beta tested on Android. So we'll expect that to come to Android at some point. And then Supercell will rule the world. And maybe they'll go to IPO and be worth more than $5 billion in a couple of years, maybe. We'll see. But kind of coming back to how all these games make money, free to play. So obviously games are free and people spend money in their games. So in the UK, the Office of Fair Trading, which is a government kind of consumer-focused body, has been looking at in-app purchase models, specifically for children. Now, this is not new. The US government has looked at this kind of stuff before. The Japanese government has passed new laws last year to limit the amount of money under 16-year-olds can spend. The OFT report was a bit different. It was actually looking at existing consumer laws. So they're not going to change any laws. They're just saying this is what the laws are at the moment. And are children being pressurised? Not just mobile games, it's online games as well. And it's a pretty interesting report. So they've not recommended changing any laws or anything. They're just saying they looked at 38 games, which they didn't say what games they were, but they basically say most of them probably contravene existing consumer law as it applies in the UK to children. And they put out a really interesting report, which is well worth looking at. So they basically given examples of a situation where a game would probably contravene the law, and a situation where a game probably wouldn't contravene the law. So they're not like laying down the law. They're kind of saying it's obviously open to interpretation. That's what the courts are there for. But the suggestion is, if you're playing in a free-to-play game and it says, "Oh, you planted a lovely tree. Do you want to make your tree grow immediately? Drop a diamond on it." That would be seen as contravening law, consumer law, as it applies to children. Whereas if you say in your game, "Oh, you've got a lovely tree. Do you want to make it grow immediately?" You can drop a gem on it, or you can wait for 10 minutes. So as soon as you're giving people the option of seeing there's a behaviour or an action that isn't a paid-for action and gets the same results, then that's fine. So it's a lot about transparency, and I kind of think globally we'll see a lot more about developers having to be much more careful about just how they're presenting stuff. And obviously this is something we look at in our monetizer feature quite a lot. So this week we've been looking at a few games there. So there's Infinity Blade 3, Cave Mania, and the Castleville Legend. So check all those out as well, and we'll catch you next week.